Hey friends, welcome back to Unpolished but Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer, and I'm going to ask for your patience. I have a bit of a cold, so if you hear me coughing, please call the grace and prayers, please. Um, if this is your first time listening, please think of the space like a warm house on a cold Alberta day. Coffee or tea brewing, socks mismatched. This is where we look at scripture without pretending life is tidy. This is where faith gets to be real instead of rehearsed. We're kicking off a December series on the apostles, and naturally, we're starting with Peter. Not because he's the most impressive, but because he's the most familiar. Out of the 12, he's the one who reads like a friend, the kind who reacts too quickly, feels everything deeply, tries hard even when he's not sure what he's doing, and ends up teaching you something by accident simply because he's honest. Peter feels like the apostle for regular people. The kind of believer who wants Jesus desperately, stumbles constantly, and somehow grows in ways he didn't see coming. He's loud, emotional, loyal, impulsive, hopeful, clumsy, brave, inconsistent, and through all of that, Jesus loved him in a steady, unshaken way. And that's where I want to begin. Not with the dramatic stories everyone knows, but with the very human moments that explain why so many of us see our own faith reflected in Peter's personality. The thing about Peter is that he didn't walk into his calling as a spiritual blank slate. He carried the full weight of who he already was. Before ever meeting Jesus, he had a job that shaped him, routines that grounded him, and a worldview molded by years of working with his hands. Fishing didn't make him famous, it made him tired. It trained him to rely on skill more than emotion, and it taught him the kind of patience only repetition can carve into a person. That background matters. It tells us that Jesus doesn't wait for people to be spiritually impressive before calling them. He meets them in the middle of real life, jobs, responsibilities, frustrations, and the mess that comes with being human. When Jesus steps into Peter's boat, nothing but that day looks like a spiritual turning point. The scene isn't dramatic. There's no choir, no spotlight, no grand announcement. Peter is washing nets after an exhausting night where nothing went right. He's not searching for purpose. He's trying to finish cleanup so he can go home. Jesus walks towards them in the simplest, most unceremonious way. He climbs into Peter's boat as if borrowing someone's truck for an afternoon. Something about that small detail hits me every time I think about it. Jesus doesn't start with a miracle. He starts with inconvenience. That kind that turns into opportunity if you don't push it away. Peter doesn't know who Jesus is at this point. He's heard the talk, maybe caught whispers from the crowd, but he doesn't see a calling forming. He sees a tired morning turning into a slightly longer one. Yet he gives Jesus space. That alone says something important. A relationship with Jesus often begins with small, reluctant yeses, not life-altering declarations. Once Jesus finishes teaching, he asks Peter to do something that makes no sense. Let the nets down again. The man has spent all night trying. He knows the water. He knows the timing. Every fisherman on that shoreline would have rolled their eyes at the suggestion. But Peter tries anyway. Not because he expects success, but because something in him responds to Jesus even before he understands him. There's something holy in the willingness to try again when you're tired of trying. Obedience often begins in those moments, the ones where you're not hopeful, not inspired, not motivated, but still open. Peter throws the net in one more time, mostly to be polite, and everything shifts. Fish begin to fill the net so quickly that the ropes pull tight. The weight is shocking, overwhelming. Peter calls for help from the other boat, because he can't manage any of it alone. And when the miracle settles in, when he's standing knee-deep in fish he couldn't catch on his own strength, something inside him breaks open. He drops his confidence, his pride, his assumptions, and falls to Jesus' knees. There's something tender about that reaction. Peter doesn't celebrate. He doesn't brag. He doesn't even smile. He sees the miracle and sees himself at the same time. And that's too much to hold. He recognizes Jesus' power and immediately feels unworthy. That feeling could have pushed him away, but Jesus doesn't allow that kind of distance. Instead, he speaks to Peter the way you'd speak to a friend who is overwhelmed. Do not be afraid. Those words are an anchor in Peter's story. They set the tone for everything that follows. Peter begins his walk with Jesus in a place of humility and awe, and he stays in that posture in one way or another for the rest of his life. What I appreciate about that moment is how it mirrors the beginning of so many of our own journeys. We come to Jesus with complicated hearts. We come with insecurities and regrets, and a sense that we're not holy enough to be chosen for anything meaningful. But Jesus isn't interested in waiting for us to qualify. He calls first, and he shapes later. Peter leaves everything, not because he suddenly becomes courageous, but because Jesus shows him something more trustworthy than his own ability. And that's usually how following Jesus starts. It's not about feeling ready. It's about recognizing a voice you can trust more than your own circumstances. The early days of Peter's discipleship reveal something else that's familiar. He didn't understand most of what Jesus was doing. He stuck close because he wanted to learn. He reacted loudly because that's who he was. He stumbled because he was still himself. And Jesus didn't rebuke every misstep. He taught him through them. One of the most relatable aspects of Peter's personality is how quickly he swings between confidence and confusion. He might make a bold statement in one breath, only to question everything the next day. He's the friend who promises to show up early and then texts you from the wrong location 50 minutes later. He's not half-hearted. If anything, his heart is too out in the open. And there's something comforting about watching Jesus lead a person like that. He doesn't flatten Peter's emotions. He doesn't silence him. He doesn't turn his intensity into something cold or controlled. Instead, Jesus channels it into courage. In the hands of Jesus, natural impulsiveness becomes responsiveness. And for many of us, that's the reassurance we need. That God isn't annoyed by the parts of us that feel, quote unquote, too much. The emotional intensity, the eagerness, the instincts to react quickly. Jesus saw all that in Peter and didn't try to fix it out of him. He shaped it so it would serve instead of sabotage. Discipleship didn't make Peter less emotional. It made him emotionally grounded in the right person. Peter followed Jesus everywhere. He listened. He asked questions. He misunderstood things. He changed slowly, then suddenly, and then slowly again. His growth wasn't linear. It came in waves. And that's probably the most accurate picture of spiritual formation I've ever seen. We spend a lot of time trying to become quote-unquote better Christians in some straight line towards maturity. But Peter's story shows us that growth happens in circles. You learn something, and then you forget it. Then you relearn it under pressure. Then you understand it more deeply later. And Jesus stays patient through the entire cycle. What makes Peter even more relatable is how inconsistent he can be. He might show fierce loyalty one day and panic the next. He might step out in boldness and then collapse under fear. He might proclaim faith with his whole heart, and then lose his footing when circumstances change. And that doesn't disqualify him. It makes him human. It makes him honest. And Jesus never once tells him, I thought you were better than this. Not once. Instead, Jesus keeps giving him space to grow. When you follow Jesus closely, your flaws become more visible to you. That's what happened to Peter. Being near Jesus didn't hide his weaknesses, it revealed them. But Jesus turned those revelations into transformations instead of shame. There's a part of Peter's early walk with Jesus that often gets overlooked. He wasn't trying to prove himself. He wasn't collecting spiritual accomplishments. He wasn't performing discipleship for the crowd. He didn't know how to be impressive. He only knew how to stay close. That closeness is what changes him, not the miracles, the crowds, the teachings he didn't fully understand, but the proximity. And Jesus never asked Peter to be flawless. He just asked him to follow. And that's the thread running through Peter's entire story. Whenever Peter loses his grounding, Jesus brings him back with that same invitation. Come with me, again and again and again. We're often taught that discipleship requires strength, but Peter teaches us that discipleship mostly requires honesty. Honesty about where we are, what we fear, how much we don't know, and why we keep coming back to Jesus anyways. Most of us are still in that space, learning, watching, trying, failing, growing slowly, discovering Jesus' patience in the parts of us that aren't polished or predictable. And this is exactly why Peter matters. If Jesus can shape someone like that, he can shape someone like us. Peter's journey with Jesus keeps unfolding in ways he never could have predicted. The early enthusiasm eventually gives way to moments that test him, stretch him, confuse him, and expose him. That's the part of spiritual growth no one really talks about. The part where following Jesus stops feeling like a fresh beginning and starts confronting the things inside us we didn't realize needed dealing with. Peter didn't wake up one morning and think, I'm going to become a spiritual leader. That kind of ambition wasn't in him. He wasn't looking for a platform or a legacy. He was just trying to stay close to a teacher who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. That closeness becomes the classroom where Peter learns who Jesus really is and who he is in the presence of someone holy. When I picture Peter in those years, I imagine a man who felt both excitement and pressure. Not pressure from Jesus, but pressure from the weight of walking behind someone who constantly challenged his assumptions. Jesus didn't coddle Peter. He didn't shield him from hard truth. He didn't pretend Peter was stronger than he was. Instead, he created moments where the truth would surface naturally, not to shame Peter, but to grow him. One of those moments happens when Jesus begins talking about his upcoming suffering. Peter reacts instantly. He pulls Jesus aside and tells him that none of this should happen. It doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from affection. Peter generally believes he is protecting Jesus. He thinks he's being loyal. But Jesus responds with a correction that still echoes because of how sharp it sounds. Get thee behind me, Satan. We hear that now and assume Jesus is angry. But the weight behind the word is protective, not punitive. Jesus isn't calling Peter evil. He's confronting the temptation behind Peter's thinking. Peter wants to follow Jesus without the cost. He wants a Messiah without sacrifice. He wants a version of faith where everything makes sense and nothing breaks his heart. Jesus knows Peter's attachment is sincere, but sincerity doesn't mean clarity. Peter loves Jesus, but he doesn't see the full story yet. He feels responsible for Jesus' safety, not realizing Jesus is the one carrying his. It's a revealing moment. Peter discovers that loving Jesus doesn't mean understanding everything he does, and that lesson sits at the core of discipleship. Closeness doesn't equal comprehension. You can walk beside Jesus daily and still wrestle with confusion. You can hear his teaching and still misinterpret his intention. You can love him deeply and still resist a part of his plan that don't fit your expectation. There's something strangely comforting about that. It means misunderstanding God isn't proof of weak faith. It's part of growing in it. Peter's learning that following Jesus sometimes means letting go of the version of Jesus he imagined. That is a turning point for many of us too. We have an idea of who Jesus should be, the one who protects us from pain, the one who prevents confusion, the one who always answers quickly, shields us from disappointment. Yet when Jesus doesn't fit those expectations, we panic. We think something is wrong, that he misheard. We think we misheard him. We might have made a mistake. But maybe the tension means he's trying to show us a deeper truth. Peter eventually learns that loving Jesus means trusting what he cannot yet understand. That discovery doesn't come from a place of strength. It comes from a place of wrestling. The kind of inner struggle that forces you to choose between what feels right and what Jesus says is true. Another moment that shaped Peter is the Transfiguration. It's one of the strangest scenes in the gospel because it almost feels too big to belong on earth. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain, and suddenly his glory breaks through his humanity. The scene doesn't look like anything they've ever known. Moses and Elijah appear. Light radiates everywhere. The atmosphere itself seems to thicken with holiness. And Peter, being Peter, talks. He blurts out an idea about building shelters for everyone. He tries to make the moment practical. He attempts to anchor the unexplainable into something manageable. The entire mountain glows with the presence of God, and Peter reaches for a solution he can understand. That's extremely human. When we don't know what to do, we fill the air with words. We try to make unexplainable moments look sensible. We try to regain control through explanation. But God interrupts Peter with something even more powerful than the scene unfolding. A voice from heaven that says, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." It's a directive, not a reprimand. God isn't correcting Peter for talking. He's redirecting him toward listening. Peter learned something essential that day. Spiritual experiences aren't about our ideas. They're about Jesus. They're not meant to make us feel special. They're meant to make us see him clearly. Peter never forgets that moment. Years later, he writes about it in his epistle, describing it not as a dramatic memory, but as proof that Jesus is who he claimed to be. What once confused him eventually became a pillar of his faith. That pattern shows up again and again. Peter struggles in the moment, but understanding usually comes afterwards. That's how the Spirit shapes him. Not in instant revelation, but in reflection. And most believers grow the same way. We rarely understand what God is teaching us while He's teaching us. Clarity often arrives later when we look back and realize the things that felt confusing or overwhelming were actually the foundations of our faith. Through these mountaintop moments and valley moments, Peter's love for Jesus keeps deepening. But the most defining moment is also the hardest. The night Jesus is arrested. When Jesus tells Peter he will deny him, Peter cannot accept that possibility. He sees himself as loyal to the bone. In his mind, he would rather die. But Jesus sees the storm coming in Peter's heart long before Peter does. When the soldiers arrive, Peter reacts the only way he knows how. He swings a sword. It's impulsive, emotional, protective, exactly who he has always been. But Jesus stops him because he's the kingdom. Because the kingdom Peter imagines doesn't match the kingdom Jesus is building. Peter wants to defend Jesus. Jesus wants Peter to understand him. After Jesus is taken away, Peter follows at a distance. The night is heavy with fear and confusion. Nothing makes sense. Everything Peter believed about loyalty is tested. And when the pressure lands on him in that courtyard, he does something he never thought he could do. He denies knowing Jesus. The words fall out of him in fear, not malice. The shame hits instantly. The moment the rooster crows, reality crashes in. Peter runs out and weeps because he sees himself clearly. Not the version of himself he wanted to be, but the version that buckles under fear. I've always found comfort in that part of the story because it shows that even the most devoted believers can collapse under pressure. Not because they don't love Jesus, but because they're human. Peter didn't deny Jesus out of rebellion. He denied him because he reached the end of his courage. When Jesus rises from the dead, the reunion with Peter is gentle. Jesus doesn't drag the failure into the light with harshness. He meets Peter with breakfast on the shore, food cooking, fire crackling, the kind of domestic normalcy that asks nothing of Peter except presence. Jesus doesn't give Peter a lecture. He gives him a meal, and then he restores him with a question that reaches into Peter's rawest places. Do you love me? It's a tender question, not why did you fail, not how could you do that, not are you going to make up for it, just do you love me? And Peter answers with honesty. He doesn't make promises. He doesn't claim he'll never fail again. He simply offers what he has left. A heart still bruised, but still loving. Jesus accepts that answer fully, and then he gives Peter his calling in 3 simple words. Feed my sheep. And that moment changes Peter more than any miracle. It proves that failure isn't the point where God gives up on us. It's the point where grace takes root. What moves me the most is that Jesus doesn't rebuild Peter's future by reminding him of his strength. He rebuilds it by reminding him of their relationship. Jesus is effectively saying, if you love me, that's enough to begin again. From that point forward, Peter becomes someone steadier, not perfect, but grounded. He preaches boldly. He leads courageously. He suffers for the gospel with conviction because his faith is no longer built on his own willpower, but on the mercy Jesus showed him. Peter's transformation wasn't the result of him finally getting it right. It was the result of him finally understanding how deeply Jesus loved him, not in his breakthroughs, but in his breaking. This entire journey from the boat to the mountaintop to the courtyard to the breakfast fire tells the story of how Jesus forms a disciple, not by eliminating their flaws, but by walking through them patiently. And this is why Peter resonates with us so deeply. He gives us permission to be real with God. He shows us that spiritual passion coexists with human weakness. He reminds us that stumbling doesn't disqualify us from walking with Jesus. Most importantly, he reveals a Savior who stays through every part of the journey, through failure, confusion, hope, heartbreak, and restoration. Peter's relationship with Jesus looked like a continual returning. Whenever he lost footing, he found the same invitation waiting for him. Come back. Follow me. And that's the message Jesus still speaks to us today. Not a demand for perfection, not a requirement for flawless obedience, just a call to stay close. And that closeness, more than knowledge, more than performance, more than discipline, is what shapes a believer into someone God can use. So, if you see yourself in Peter, you're not seeing weakness, you're seeing possibility. You're seeing a life Jesus can work with. You're seeing a heart that can be formed, softened, strengthened, and anchored. Peter didn't become the rock because he was naturally steady. He became the rock because he let Jesus shape him. And that means the same transformation is still possible for us. Thanks for spending this time with me on Unpolished but Called. If Peter's story reminded you that Jesus stays close through every stage of your imperfect, beautiful, messy walk, I hope you carry that comfort into the rest of your week. Make sure to follow, subscribe, and share so you don't miss the next episode in our Apostles series. And if you want devotional books, study guides, printables, or any other free downloads waiting for you, you can find them all at kathrinshaffer.com. We'll talk again soon. Keep walking with Jesus. Even if you're wobbling a little, he's not letting go.